Hi, today in our writers and artists section, we're going to be doing a writer. His name is Robert Kanigher, and he is probably one of DC's really early writers. And he was very prolific for DC. He wrote a lot of stuff, I'm telling you. A lot of stuff. And he created a lot of memorable characters. One of them being Sergeant Rock. We'll go a little bit into him later on, his origins. And he also was known for taking over both Wonder Woman comics when William Moulton passed away. But anyway, Robert Kanigher was born on June 18th, 1915 in New York City, New York. His parents were Ephraim and Rebecca Kanigher, and he had two other siblings as well. At 12 years old, Robert began working because the Great Depression was going on. A lot of people out of work, a lot of families were starving and not doing too well. So he went to work doing what, I don't know. But he found that during this time, going to school, working part-time, he also liked to write. He thought writing was pretty cool. And so he would continue learning how to do that and improve upon it, I assume through school and college. During that time, he would write short stories and poetry, and they were published in magazines, I assume, in his high school years and probably college years. In 1932, at the age of 17, he entered in the New York Times Collegiate Short Story Contest, and he won. So that probably pushed him to do more writing, and he did. And he would move from there, and he found that he could a place where people needed writers for then radio programs. And one of them was called The Cavalcade of America. And so he wrote an episode about young Major Washington. And this episode, also just a side note for us geeky guys like me, premiered a young new actor named Gregory Peck. I thought that was kind of interesting. I'll have to look up the episode and listen to it. Later on, he would write some books. They were how to make money books. And they included movies, manuscripts, comics, and I guess they sold fairly well. I think he did okay. I found a cover to, I think, the movies one. I couldn't find anything else on the others. And after that, he would then later on move into writing comics. He decided he wanted to get into that. And so in the 1940s, he would get on a book called Zip Comics. I think it was number 25. He would write stories about the original Blue Beetle. And his artist on the book was E.C. Stoner, and inker was E.C. Stoner. Also in that time, he found that Archie Comics, which was, I think, again called MLJ, was introduced a new character called Steel Sterling. He decided to write a story or two of those. Artist was a young Irv Novick, and he inked himself, Irv Novick. You'll know Irv Novick, if you're familiar with DC books from the 60s and 70s, did a lot of stuff for DC later on, most specifically in Batman and Detective Comics. He would then go on, I read, to do some stories about an Archie character called the Web. Had a yellow and green costume and had a cool gun that would shoot webs and stuff. But I looked through a lot of the books he was in. I couldn't find any information to show which issue he started in or even did. But I'm assuming it's correct. It also stated that he wrote Captain Marvel Shazam, Captain Marvel Adventures, the Captain Marvel Adventures book. I was able to go through the first 100 of those things. Let me tell you, that took a lot of time. And had a lot of issues where they didn't have full credits, and so I could not find anything that he wrote, but I'm taking it on faith that he did write some of them, especially back in the early 40s. During this time, he would meet Sheldon Mayer of All American Comics, and this was a sister company to then national periodicals, which they would marry All American Comics in with DC Comics, or in the national periodicals, and they would become DC Comics. Anyway, Sheldon Mayer would hire Robert to work as a script or writer, and then later on he would have him become an editor. He was assigned to do the following characters. Flash Comics then was Jay Garrick, got the metal helmet, it's cool. And the backup story then was Hawkman, the original Golden Age Hawkman. And he would start in Flash Comics number 81, March of 1947. Artist Everett E. Hibbard, inker Everett E. Hibbard. The Hawkman artist was John Chester Koziak, and inker was John Chester Koziak. You'll notice during this, a lot of these artists inked themselves. Man, think of the money savings that they had there. Anyway, in Flash Comics 1986, or excuse me, in Flash Comics number 86, 1947, artist Lee Elias and inker was Joe Kubert. In the Johnny Thunder, that was the story he wrote for Flash. In the Johnny Thunder secondary story, art was by a young Carmen Infantino, inker Joe Giella. And he introduces a brand new character he created called the Black Canary. And it's also artist Carmen Infantino of DC fame, mostly his first DC work, which I thought was interesting. And Joe Giella, I believe, went and did some Marvel work too, but I was amazed at how young these guys were back then. He would later also, in Green Lantern number 29, December 1947, this is the Alan Scott Green Lantern. Love the Alan Scott Green Lantern. Love the look, everything about him. He will introduce a new villain for DC called the Harlequin. No relation to the Harlequin you see nowadays. All right. The artist was Irwin Hassan, and the inkers were John Belfi. And she would be around for quite a while and then disappear. He would then be asked to do a story for one of their bigger team books, one of the first team books to come out in a while. It was the Justice Society of America in All-Star Comics number 37, November of 1947. And those stories, those comics were usually 64 pages, and usually the team has broken up into little separate teams, and then they be together, break up in little groups, and then fight the villain at the end. Because this one had artists Irwin Hassan, Joe Kubert, Carmen Infantino, Alex Toth, and they also did all the inking on this story. And then in 1945, in Sensation Comics issue number 41, he would take over the writing chores from William Moulton. Artist was Harry G. Peters, and inker was Harry G. Peters. And in 1948, Robert was appointed to edit and then write Wonder Woman, starting with issue number 30, July of 1948, who was also being drawn by Harry G. Peters and inked by Harry G. Peters. William Moulton was either quit and then died, or he died, and that was it. Never could get the exact thing on what was going on with that. Later, just before that, he would also create a new character, a villain maybe, called the Rose and Thorn. She would go ahead and appear in Flash number 89. Came out in 1947. I forgot to put the actual month date, but anyway, the artist was Joe Kubert, inker Joe Kubert. And she was a scientist, I assume a biologist, plant biology, who was working with the scientist in Africa, finding some rare plants and stuff. And she claimed later that she had a sister, and her sister worked with a thorn, and she worked with the rose, hence the names. But you find out that she actually is just one person, Rose Canton, and she has a split personality. By day, she's a good person, and at night she becomes the evil Thorn, robbing banks and becoming what you would call a thorn in Jay Garrick, the Flash's side. And this character would go to last through this series, off and on, to plague the Flash, and then later on she would resurface in the new modern DC stuff that occurred after 1956. And Robert Kanigher would move on from here and do many, many more stories for DC during this time, and more than I can tell you. So if you're ever curious, I've got a bibliography at the end again, and you can take a look and see what he's done. Anyway, we're going to move into the 50s. And in the 50s, comics started dying off. A lot of companies got canceled, They folded up like Quality and things like that. And DC also saw the hit. A lot of their characters were slowing down, and they were trying to figure out ways to try and get the interest back up. And so they looked to their editors to help them, one of them being Robert Kanigher, and they came up with the idea that why don't we re-up some of the characters? Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, they're our mainstay. We'll just change the books a little bit, and upgrade them. But like Flash, canceled at 104, Jay Garrick, he's out of there. Green Lantern, gone. A lot of comics disappeared, and so they were going to reintroduce them. And they did. Green Lantern was reintroduced. Kanigher, as far as I could tell, had nothing to do with it, but he did begin the run in Showcase number 4, October 1956. He would write this issue. He'd bring his one of his favorite artists, Carmen Infantino, and favorite artist inker, Joe Kubert, and bring in the Flash, Barry Allen, the Flash. And he would get his first shot in Showcase 4 and run off and on during this for quite a few years. And they realized that they would modernize his character, his origin, a little more science fiction stuff in it, perhaps, upgrade the villains, change the stories a little bit more, kind of modernize it from what it was in the 40s and early 50s. And guess what? It was a smash hit. People loved it. They thought it was great. And it was a success. And so they decided, let's continue doing this in Showcase. We'll continue to create new characters and see if they're very popular. Maybe we can spin them off into their new books. And Kanigher would be part of it. And so they would move on. So in 1958, realizing that this change is working, he decided to modernize Wonder Woman. Sensation Comics, the other book, was canceled. So now there's just Wonder Woman. So in Wonder Woman 98, May of 1958, artist Ross Andru was introduced with inker Mike Esposito. And he would do things he introduced a teenage Wonder Girl. I always thought maybe this would be the Wonder Girl that would transition into the Teen Titans, who showed up in the mid-60s. I wasn't sure. I think it was that way. It should have been that way, I think. He also introduced someone called the Wonder Tot, like a 6-year-old, Wonder Woman, and a new set of kind of weird and bizarre villains, more science fiction-y. But he would leave the book in issue 176 in 1968 for a while. It was that last book. Here's a cover. It was drawn by Irv Novick and inked by Mike Esposito. From there, not from here, but from earlier, 1959, in All-American Men at War, number 67, artist Ross Andru, inker Mike Esposito, can tell who his favorites were. He would introduce the first set of war heroes that were reoccurring in their comic, and they were called Gunner and Sarge, and they would have a little white dog with them, and they would fight in World War II. And go through all sorts of adventures. It was interesting because it was the first to establish in these, usually anthology stories, to put reoccurring characters in them, even though they don't have their own book with their own name. Because this would then occur in June of 1959 in Our Army at War, number 83. Artist Joe Kubert, inker Joe Kubert. Joe Kubert, great artist, seriously. He would create one of the America's big icon comic characters, Sergeant Rock. And what happened was he created this character who is this hard-nosed, rough and tough type of sergeant, but sometimes good-hearted leader of the famous troop of soldiers called Easy Company. And Easy Company actually was a real company, because if you ever watched Band of Brothers, the first series, that was all about Easy Company in World War II. But anyway, it was a good book. It dealt with a lot of just not typical American killing off Nazis. It dealt with a lot of personal issues and stuff. They had a set of regular characters in there. Sergeant Rock and, I can't remember the names of the other guys. I probably should have looked them up. Didn't even think about that. I'm getting old. But they also bring in a rookie usually most of the time. And it's usually a story that involved the rookie learning about war and how rough it is. Perhaps getting killed or surviving it and moving on to another company and stuff. But it was really good writing and beautiful artwork. Joe Kubert was such a wonderful artist. And his 2 sons became artists later on and pretty famous right now. Anyway, they fought in World War II. He didn't go to the war in the Pacific, as far as I know, unless there was a short story where he got forced to do it. But in one of the books, a rookie asked a veteran how Rock got his name, because I guess that's not his real name. And the guy says, "Son, let me tell you, it's this way, because when the going gets so rugged that only a rock could stand the hell that they call war, and there he stands like a rock." So that was what they said about him. Okay, so after Showcase 4 was introduced, he would then go to Sea Devils. Showcase number 27, August 1960. with artist Russ Heath, great artist too, by the way. He also inked himself and did wonderful covers from here and all, through his stuff in the Sea Devils and some, I think, Challenger books and stuff. He just beautiful painted covers. I loved them. He would then go on to do Showcase 37, April 1962. Features a new group called the Metal Men, a bunch of robots with intellects that worked for their creator to do superhero stuff. It was artists Ross Andru, inker Mike Esposito. In Showcase 57, August 1965. He would then premiere a World War I flying ace named Enemy Ace, a German ace. And he would fight against the French and the British, and I assume the Americans and stuff. But he did it begrudgingly. He did it because he was German, and he had to do it. The artwork was by Joe Kubert, and inker was Joe Kubert. But if you ever get a chance, Enemy and Ace was really a good story. All of these characters would then go on to have major hits in the 1960s and some into the 70s. And some, if not all of them, are still used off and on today in DC. I don't know about after New 52, how many of them are being used still. That's later. During this time, comics would phase into what they called the Silver Age. That was started with Showcase 4. And they would change up everything. Everything gets changed, gets modernized. And so you would see, like I say, Flash would show up, and he would go into and take the numbering of the old Flash and begin in Flash 105, March of 1959, artist Carmen Infantino, inker Joe Giella. And that would go on to be a phenomenal success, still being done today. In a book called Brave and the Bold, he would introduce a comic series called The Suicide Squad. I forgot the number. It's September 1959. Artist Ross Andru, inker is Mike Esposito, and this is a group of, I believe, ex-World War II people that would go on like secret missions and types of stuff. And the name would live on when it becomes like you've seen some of the movies and stuff, a bunch of villains that you either, did what I tell you and will forgive your sentence or will blow your head off. So anyway, after that, in a book called Star Spangled War Stories, number 90, an anthology war book, May of 1960, artist Ross Andru, inker Mike Esposito, he would bring in one of my favorite type of books called The War That Time Forgot. It was a great series, man. Usually it was World War II. There's this island out there filled with dinosaurs, cavemen, all sorts of stuff like that, time stood still. And occasionally, people get dropped off there from the war. Boats crash land there. Sometimes it's Americans fighting, the Japanese or possibly even the Germans. But, they had to fight each other or fight together to survive against what? Dinosaurs. Score. Dinosaurs. So it was good. It was a great series. It ran quite a long time in Star Spangled War Stories. I do recommend it. In October of 1961, he would introduce Sea Devils #1. Artist, great Russ Heath. Inker, great Russ Heath. Cover, beautiful covers, Russ Heath. Oh, it's a fun series. I enjoyed it. These people had no superpowers. They were scuba divers, and they would go on missions to stop crime and, other types of things, maybe environmental issues possibly. And it was a fun book. It was interesting because scuba diving was still in its infancy back then somewhat. Not too many people really saw much of it unless you watched Sea Hunt, which is a great TV series. Anyway, in GI Combat number 87, May 1961, he would introduce another anthology series, a long-running series that would go on for probably about a decade or so. And it was called The Haunted Tank. And it's about what they had, a Sherman tank, I believe it was. And it was haunted by the ghost of, I think it was General Sherman. But anyway, it was, Jeb Stuart was the name of the guy who was in charge of a crew that would go on missions in World War II. And this general would show up, and he would give cryptic messages about what the mission would be like. And you would see that cryptic message come about in each story mostly. It eventually led to the death of one of his crew members, much years later. It's a good series. They stayed in GI Combat up until its demise. In May of 1963, he introduces Metal Men #1, which he would write. All these books, I'm telling you, he would write. Artist was, again, Ross Andru, Mike Esposito. They were pretty busy in the early days of DC. That would go on to go into the into the late or early 70s and stuff, and still surviving today. Enemy Ace would then appear from Showcase, and Our Army at War number 151 is a backup story, and the art was done by the great Joe Kubert and was inked by Kubert. And during this time, Kubert's artwork really, in my opinion, started becoming phenomenal. Just loved his stuff. Really fit the war mood beautifully. And he would be in this off and on, and then be moved to, later on in May of 1968, in Star Spangled War Stories, number 138, artist Joe Kubert, inker Joe Kubert, and he would stay in that for quite a while. In 1966, doing something different, he would write a Batman story with artist Sheldon Moldoff, inker Joe Giella, and he would introduce a character called Poison Ivy. Gee, do we know who Poison Ivy is? I do. God, she's everywhere. And very, very famous villain around still today. Much changed since there. Also in 1966, in Our Army at War, number 168, they tried a guest story. He wrote a story called, with a character who saved Sergeant Rock, and he was called The Unknown Soldier. And artist was Joe Kubert, inker by Joe Kubert. He did this one story, and then he would later show up in Star Spangled War Stories, number 151, June, July 1970. Writer Joe Kubert. I'm saying this because Kanigher created. He didn't write this. It was artist Joe Kubert, inker Joe Kubert. And he would stay in Star Spangled War Stories until pretty much his demise. Became a popular character, still used off and on. I don't know about currently in the 2020s, but it was good stuff, great stuff. He was the character that had no, he was like the unknown soldier. Remember, they have a grave to an unknown soldier, and they made a story about it being him. They faked his death. So I think his face got blown off, or he kept it hidden so people wouldn't know who he was, and he would do masks and stuff and infiltrate and do secret espionage missions. It was really cool. He would then take some characters he worked on in comics that didn't make it. Captain Storm. God, I'm trying to remember who these guys are. Anyway, he would group them together in GI Combat number 138 along with Jeb Stewart's Haunted Tank, and they were called the Losers. And artist was Russ Heath, again, inker Russ Heath, and they would stay in there for quite a long time. And during this time, he would then introduce characters. I didn't want to go too much into these. They didn't make it very far, but like Brave and the Bold, he introduced a medieval character called the Viking Prince. Great stuff. It was fun. Another war book, I believe it was in Civil War, called the Balloon Busters. These guys fought crime or did stuff in a big hot air balloon. Just to name a few. There are other things out there too, but trust me. And so we go from the 60s into the 70s, where not quite as much stuff being created. I think he did a lot more editing and just general writing for all the other books that they have. He would reintroduce his characters, Rose and Thorn, but a modern version of them, in Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane, number 105, October of 1970. And the artist was Ross Andru and inker Mike Esposito. And Rose and Thorn got a miniseries and stuff, but she never really achieved the stardom he got on some of his other characters, but she's still around. They still use her off and on. She's kind of a vigilante type character now, but still fun. I enjoyed the characters. And then he did something that I either forgot or didn't know about, but he went and did Iron Man number 44, January 1972. He wrote it along with Jerry Conway. Artist was George Tuska, inker Vince Coletta, and Mike Esposito. And did one story, just one story for Iron Man, and I remember it. It was pretty good. And then he did, Marvel had a book called Our Love Story, number 19, October 1972. He did a 7-page story with artist Kurt Schaffenberger, who was known for a lot of Supergirl, Superman stuff in the 60s for DC. Inker Frank Giacoa. And I hope I didn't kill that name, but as far as I can pronounce it. Later on, he returned. He's still working at DC. He would introduce a new character called Rima, the Jungle Girl, number 1. That was actually a pretty good book. Ran 7 issues, didn't make it. 1974, artist Nestor Redondo, inker Nestor Redondo. He would then later on in 1976 have a miniseries called Ragman #1, September 1976. Artist Joe Kubert and Redondo Studios. And that's the Redondo. A lot of Redondos were doing artwork across the board there. And the inkers were Joe Kubert and Redondo Studios. Now, Ragman was a pretty interesting book. And it was where this kid whose parents were survivors of the Holocaust and stuff were murdered. And he wants to get revenge for them, for his parents and his friends. They were all Jewish. And so he makes a costume from their clothes and becomes Ragman and becomes a superhero. And it imbues him with this like mystical power, because he would go after villains. And after he would defeat them or kill them, I think, he would then absorb them and they would become a piece of his rag costume and stuff. So pretty interesting. He had about 2 miniseries, but he shows up off and on through DC's time. I think they've kind of changed him a little bit, but still an interesting character. He would then later teach at Joe Kubert's School of Cartoon and Graphic Art for 1 year. In 1977, I assume he taught writing. In the 1980s, he would take over the writing chores for one of my favorite books, in Weird War Tales, starting with issue 108, February of 1982. He would take over writing chores. He didn't create them, but he took over writing of the Creature Commandos, which, believe it or not, I heard rumors that James Gunn is looking at possibly making either a TV show or a movie with the Creature Commandos, which are a vampire, right? Dracula, but not him, but it's a vampire, a Frankenstein monster, Medusa, a werewolf, I think possibly a mummy, I'm not sure. But pretty interesting. They fought World War II, just so you know. And the artist was Pat Broderick. God, what a great artist this guy was. Loved his Firestorm stuff, man. Everything he touched, I thought was gold. The inker was a great inker, I thought, John Beatty. And this ran until issue number 124 when it was canceled. Robert Kanigher stayed busy writing and editing during all these years. He was a workaholic. He loved doing this stuff, kept doing it till his death on May 7th in 2002. And I loved his work. I grew up on it. I was a young guy. I just enjoyed reading a lot of his stuff. And I think he did a lot of great things for DC. And so, Robert, I thank you for wherever you're at, for all the great work you gave me. I love collecting comic books and reading comic books. And like I say, at the end of this, I have listed a bibliography. It's going to rotate up slowly, and it's about 4 pages long of stuff that I could find to read, and pass on to you. So if you're ever interested, possibly want to look at his work, here's a chance to find some of it. I believe most of it's correct. There are a lot of stuff that's not on there, stuff I couldn't find, and so I did the best I could. So anyway, I thank you for watching this. I hope you'll think about giving some of Robert Kanigher's books a try. A lot of them aren't really super expensive. A lot of comic stores have beat-up boxes. A lot of war books end up being thrown in boxes that are beat up and stuff. So you may find them in there for $1, couple bucks. I mean, comics are getting expensive. And a lot of the stuff is good reading because I promote reading. I want you to read comics. You may invest in them. I think that's great if you can make money, but you should also read them. These guys put a lot of hard work into this stuff, and they deserve to be read and appreciated for the writing, artwork, inking, coloring, even editing, that type of stuff. And with that, I'm going to close, and thank you very much for tuning in.